So, if natural resources, capital goods, technology, and quantity and quality of workers change potential GDP and aggregate supply, but a change in the cost of your factors of production only changes aggregate supply, then we need to be able to see that difference here on a graph. Okay, so when we talk about changes to natural resources, capital goods, technology, or quantity and quality of labor, then when you change aggregate supply, so aggregate supply increases, it will have an equal increase in potential GDP. So you'll notice here where potential GDP and aggregate supply intersect, we've just shifted that whole thing over. If we're talking about a change in the cost of the factors of production, then we're changing aggregate supply only and potential GDP stays where it is. Then if we start to add in aggregate demand to these graphs, we can start to see what's happening to our equilibrium size of the economy. So remember, equilibrium is where aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect. So here's our equilibrium. In the left graph, let's suppose that we experience an increase in technology. That's going to increase aggregate supply and increase potential GDP. So that moves aggregate supply and potential GDP here, but aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect here. So our new equilibrium is actually here, and then we're no longer at what is called full employment equilibrium. Full employment equilibrium is where your aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect, and that's also where you're at your potential. If where aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect, we're not also at our potential, then we're not at the full employment equilibrium. We're in a gap, either an expansionary gap or a recessionary gap. Notice on the far right graph, if the cost of our factors of production go up, aggregate supply will shift to the right. This does not change potential GDP. So we could go from full employment equilibrium to a point now where aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and so our equilibrium real GDP, is now bigger than our potential GDP. So in this case, the actual size of our economy is bigger than our potential size of our economy. So let's look more at this to determine, are we in a recessionary gap, an expansionary gap, or are we at full employment equilibrium? So let's plot some examples and then look at where is equilibrium and what size of gap do we have. All right, so where aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect, this is the equilibrium size of the economy. This determines the price level. So if this price level, for example, is 130, then what that tells you is there's been 30% inflation since the base year. So it's some kind of consumer price index or other type of price index. It could also be a GDP deflator. But it's a measure of overall price within the economy. And then down here we have our real GDP. What is the size of our economy in terms of the total value of what we produce and what people buy? Okay, so notice that here at equilibrium, the amount that households, businesses, government, the rest of the world, the total amount that people are willing and able to buy is equal to the amount that businesses are willing and able to sell. So we are at equilibrium, and that tells us the size of the economy. So now let's look at a specific scenario. So suppose this data represents your country, and here are the different price indices. Tells us about the amount of inflation. And here we have aggregate quantity demanded and aggregate quantity supplied. So let's plot this information on a graph, and then we can start answering some of these questions. All right, so if we plot our data, then at a price of 96, aggregate quantity demanded is 1145, and at 97, 1125, and at 98, 1105, 99, 1085, at 100, 1065, all right, at 101, 1045, at 102, 1025, at 103, 1005, and 104, 985, and 105, 965. So if we connect those dots, there we have aggregate demand. And we can also plot aggregate supply, so same thing, at 96, it's at 880. At 97, it's 940. At 98, it's 965. At 99, it's 985. At 100, it's 1,000. At 101, it's 1015. At 102, it is 1025. At 103, it's 1033. At 104, it's 1040. And at 105, 1055. So here we have aggregate demand that's downward sloping. And we talked earlier in this level as to why aggregate demand is downward sloping. Recall 3 effects. And those 3 effects were the real balance effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign trade effect makes the downward sloping aggregate demand. Aggregate supply is upward sloping. The higher the prices, the more businesses are willing and able to sell, assuming nothing else is changing, including cost. All right. Oh, I think I screwed up on this graph here. Let me go back in time a bit here. 102. Oh, there we go. Okay. So now we need to figure out equilibrium. How big is the size of this economy? Well, we're looking for where aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect at a price level of 102. And that is when real GDP is equal to 1025. So the size of our economy, total value of what we make and sell, is $1,000 and $1,025. Our price index of 102 tells us that we've had 2% inflation since the base year. Now, what if the price was 100? So if we were looking at a price of 100, then we're not in equilibrium. So tell me, do we have a shortage or a surplus? Well, notice that aggregate demand, when the price is 100, aggregate demand is 1065, and aggregate supply is 1,000. So we want to buy $1,065 worth of goods. Businesses want to sell $1,000 worth of goods. So there is a shortage, $65 worth of goods shortage. Shortages drive up price, which is why our equilibrium is above it. Okay. Now, what if the price was 104? If we were at a price level of 104, then quantity supplied. So if we look at 104, the aggregate quantity supplied is 1040. The aggregate quantity demanded is 985. So at higher prices, businesses want to sell more than we all want to buy. And so do we have a shortage or a surplus? We have a surplus. Okay, and how big is that surplus? Well, it's a difference between the fact that businesses want to sell $1,040 worth of goods and households want to buy 980, not just households, but households, businesses, government, rest of the world, collectively, we want to buy $985 worth. So the difference between the two, 1040 minus 985, that difference gives you the size of the surplus, and so we have a surplus here of $55 worth of goods. All right, well, let's start to look at what happens to this equilibrium when we change aggregate demand, when we change aggregate supply. Now let's look at what happens to our equilibrium price and real GDP when we start to change aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we're going to take the same information we had before. And so we've plotted here aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And now let's look at what happens when you change aggregate demand. So let's pose that aggregate demand increases, and we're increasing it. Let's say there's an increase in aggregate demand of 50. So essentially we're going here, and let's see, going 50 here. This is going over 50 here, here. So everything gets shifted over by 50. Oops, that's probably a little too far over here. Here, here. Okay, so we could actually measure, to be precise, we could shift every number over by 50. Do that, we approximately get what we have here. So aggregate demand has increased or shifted to the right. So before, our equilibrium had a price level of 102, and we had a real GDP of 1025. So now that everything, or all the aggregate demand has shifted to the right, we're no longer at equilibrium when the price level is 102. Because households, businesses, government, the rest of the world is now willing to buy more at that price level. And so what we have is that we have the amount that we're willing to buy. So that's our quantity, our aggregate quantity demanded, is more than our aggregate quantity supplied. So notice there's a difference here. And so we actually have a shortage. And that shortage drives up the price. So where do we end up? Well, on our graph, we end up about here. So we have a price level, let's say, of 103.75. Okay, and what's happened to real GDP? Well, real GDP has increased, and now it looks like it's closer to 1045. So when aggregate demand increases, we get inflation. So we go from a price level here of 102 to 103.75. So now we're looking at 3.75% inflation since the base year, and we're looking at our real GDP increasing as well. So an increase in aggregate demand increases inflation and increases the size of our economy. Well, what happens if you increase aggregate supply? So we could take our same graph here, and instead of changing aggregate demand, we change aggregate supply. So let's see a $50 increase in aggregate supply. And so we're going to shift everything over by 50. So here's our aggregate supply curve. Shift to the right. Hopefully yours is a bit more accurate than mine. So if you added 50 to all the numbers, you could find the new points. And so what does that do to our equilibrium? Well, before we had a price index of 102, and we had a real GDP of 1025. Now with that increase in aggregate supply at the current price level, businesses are willing to sell more than we're all willing to buy, so we have a surplus. And we can find that surplus because that's the difference between here and here. And so we have a surplus of 50 there, and that's going to drive down the price, and we'll end up with a new price level here. So price of 100.5, and real GDP will increase. So that looks like it's what, 10.55 maybe? So real GDP has increased when aggregate supply increased, and we now have less inflation. So we went from 2% inflation from the base year to now 0.5% of inflation since the base year. So prices fall when aggregate supply increases. Now we could have just as easily gone the other direction. So if aggregate supply decreases, we get inflation and real GDP goes down. If aggregate demand decreased, then that would cause us to go this other direction here, in which case we see that we get deflation and real GDP declines.